Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, for those who are new, my name is Mildred, and I am the developer of the ECBS system and also the consultant for the case-based surveillance. We are going to start now. I was waiting for others to join, but we will provide the recording for those who joined late or who are not able to make it today. Yesterday, we looked at the basics and the introduction to the API. For some people who are not in IT, it was requested that we go from the basics. So today we're just going to speed up, just summarize what we did yesterday, and then move on to today's agenda. Now, API is the application programming interface that we have chosen to build for other systems to be able to request data from the case-based surveillance system. Now, for this consultancy, it is a one-way API where the API for the ECBS has no knowledge of other systems, but we can make other systems have knowledge of the ECBS and request information. For instance, if HIV management information has been entered into the ECBS system for a particular client, let's say a client is HIV positive, to have all the labs on the system and all the clinical management with all of the prescriptions that the doctor has given this client. And this client goes to a different clinic that does not deal with HIV management. Let's say this same client is diabetic and is going to a different clinic for management. If there is a health information system for the country that records for other health or non-communicable diseases are entered into the system, then maybe the doctor will want to know what the case report for the client is from the ECBS system without having to go physically to that site or request a medical report. Can just see it from whatever system it is they're using without logging onto ECBS. Now, for this API to work, the countries will need to put some code on your systems depending on if you have access to the source code, and we're going to look at how you can edit a page of your system, whatever system you want to communicate with the ECBS, to get information from the endpoint. The case-based surveillance system has three systems. We have the patient management and reporting system, which is the system where we collect all the data and all the information that we need for reporting. Then the virtual training workshop portal is just a portal to facilitate training workshop virtually and also certifications and assessment. And then we have the API. Now the API is the contract that the ECBS will have with other systems. All it does is just to grant an API key to another system or to an external partner that wants to be able to access aggregated or disaggregated data from the system. So on the home page, we'll find API. This is not a login button. It just takes you directly to the API of the system. Now, APIs can be done as far as you're customizing an API. You can build it whichever way you want. And I've been trying to make it so that it can be compatible with the use case in the countries. So when I click on the login here, it takes me directly to the home page for the API. Now, this home page is where every user can request an API key. Now, I'm going to show you what the API key is needed for. Two things. One is if you give direct access to the API domain. Most of the time, APIs are internal tools. We don't give access to the dashboard outside of the government network or outside of the system. But in the event that you do, we want the API key to be like the login for the user. And if you don't, you want the API key to be part of the environment variables that other systems must have to be able to communicate with or request data from the ECBS database. Does anyone have any question? Okay, I will assume nobody has questions. We have this API dashboard, but the first thing we have to do is to request a key. And when the key is requested, an administrator will have to grant access or assign a key to the user who requested the key. When we go back to the ECBS system and we log into the patient management and reporting system, We have said yesterday that the administration role of the system has the API configuration functionality, and this functionality is one that is accessible to anybody who is assigned the administration role, regardless of the permissions that they have been assigned. And so if I log in as an administrator, I will see API configuration here. One of the first things you want to do before you start using your API is to generate keys on your live system. Now, for all the countries, your APIs are not yet uploaded on your live system. It is going to be done this weekend once I get the subdomain to host the API, if you want it that way. So the first thing you want to do is to generate API keys by just clicking the button to generate key. The key is a 16 alphanumeric code that is separated by hyphen, and so the users must enter the API key the same way it is generated. Now, once you generate this key, you have a list of keys that you can use for your system. Now, these are just trial keys that will be deleted after the training, but your live keys will not be accessible by anyone to see your API keys. Now, the reason we're using key is just for control, and it's just like a unique identifier and like a secret token that authenticates an application or a user when they want to make call to the data. So you have control over who has access to your data and who doesn't, or what system can access your data and what system can't. Once you generate the keys, you have enough key to move on to grant API keys. Now, for you to grant API keys, the user or the client or the system would have come to this dashboard to request a key. Let's say we have pharmacy system. Let's just call it pharmacy. And the email address of whoever the administrator for that system, let me just put an email address. And then the reason for the key, let's say to get data, and I'll request key. If this is successful, it will be submitted for approval. When I come back to this dashboard, I will see that pharmacy in the list of partners. So this person requested a key. I can also come here to get keys request here to see that an organization or a system, pharmacy, requested a key to feed the data into their system, and the status is pending. So once the status is pending, it now means that the system or that partner has not yet been assigned an API key for use. So you can come here now to say you want to grant key, select that system, and then you choose a key. Now, the keys you get in the drop-down menu are keys that have not yet been assigned. So anytime you come here and you don't find keys in the drop-down menu, it means you need to generate new keys. The keys, just click the button and new keys will be added. Now we have 4 keys here. If I come here to generate new keys, I will get an extra key here. And so when I come here to want to grant key, I will get a list of 5 keys. So the more keys you generate is what feeds the drop-down menu. And so once I select a key, you can set an expiry date for the key. And now the reason for this again is also for control. You don't want to grant keys forever, especially if a key is requested just for testing purpose, to be able to test the communication between two systems. Maybe you give them a testing period of 2 weeks and you set the expiry date for 2 weeks. So after that date, that system or that external partner can no longer have access to your records, and you don't need to try to start monitoring who has access to delete or not to delete. It just expires at the set time, and if they require more time, then they can send you an email to request time. So it gives you better control to keep your data secured. So let's say we set the expiry date to 16th, and then we assign the key to this. Now, a key has been assigned to this pharmacy system. Depending on how that system was built or how the source code is structured for the pharmacy system, most of the time in modern systems, you will get environment files. Within your environment files, you can set new environment variables and set the value of your API key to be the API key there. Once your environment variable is set, then the communication can start taking place. We are going to look at how we set the environment variable shortly. You can also come here to look at all of the keys that has been assigned, who keys were assigned to, their keys, and the expiry date. If for any reason you need to extend expiry date for any client or any system, you can just come here to edit the date and click the button. Does anyone have any question? So is it understandable?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay.
It's clear for me.
All right.
Yes, I understand.
Okay. So now we have this pharmacy API key. Let me copy this key. When I come to the API now and I come to login, once I enter that key and log in, it takes me to a dashboard that defines all of the endpoints that I need to configure my pharmacy system to get data from this endpoint. Now, because of security reasons, and this is recorded and is going to be posted for everyone to see, I limited the amount of routes that we'll see here and unique IDs. Your documentation and your live system will have the complete list, but this will give us an idea of what we need to do using this route. Now, when you get your endpoints, first of all, before I talk about routes and endpoints, let me just explain. It's most of the time you find these things used interchangeably, and it can get confusing what each one means. When I specify this, I mean the route, right? And when I try to get information from this using an HTTP method, then it becomes the endpoint. So when you say route, it just means what is the / what is the route. When I add it to, let's say, get this, then that is the endpoint. That's where you are sending, that's the endpoint you're trying to hit to return the data. If I say post, that's the endpoint you're trying to hit to send the data to. So we already know about HTTP, and we know that is a transfer protocol that we use, and there are different methods for it. We have get, we have post, we have put, patch, delete. For the ECBS API, get and post are the only methods that are used for now. And the reason is it's not a two-way communication where we are trying to update the ECBS system, which is something you can do. You can have an API for your pharmacy system that when any medication is prescribed, you want to send a put request to the ECBS database to also update the prescriptions of that client, so that when anybody logs in at the HIV or IDC clinic to see the prescriptions, they'll see that from a different clinic these medications were prescribed. So if the client fails or forgets to tell the doctor that they are on particular medications, then the doctor can be aware of drug-drug interaction or know the drugs or the medications that the client is on. But that is a different one. For this ECBS system, the other systems can only get information from the ECBS. The API can be made to be a two-way API. That's a different consultancy. For this one, is just a one-way API, where ECBS can give out information that is requested and can also request information from other systems. Now, the reason is one way is that the other systems, there needs to be a defined, each country have different systems with different standards, different programming languages. The only way to unify systems is when we have a unified ID. So across the country, if let's say there's a hospital registration number that the clients use throughout the system, or a social security number throughout the system, then it is easier to now build an API that just looks at that ID and checks all the systems with that ID and unify the record in one system. So if a record is entered in the lab, all the other system gets the same information because it's the same ID. But the events that the ID system for different systems are totally different, and we do not know, or except those that use a single login, but except that we don't know in advance how the IDs or the hospital number or the client numbers for each system within the countries are created, and what language, if the countries have proprietary access or access to the source code to be able to make edits, know how the database is structured, to be able to say these are the different columns of this particular database table that stores this information, and we want to create an endpoint that extracts information from this table. So until that happens, this remains a one-way API where all systems can connect to ECBS, but ECBS will not connect to other systems. When you get to this dashboard, you find the endpoint. Now let's look at what endpoint is for us to be able to create a page where we can actually hit this endpoint without having to programmatically do things. That page, I'll show you how to create that page on your different systems. So when you want to communicate with ECBS from any system, you create that page, and then you have that page for maybe the administrator or whoever to just click a button and get information. Now I'll go to that plate and hold on. I'm going to minimize all of this. Okay. So now we have the endpoints. Let's use this for example, defined like this, where we have a function that is bound to a route. Now, if a user comes to a route register, so the domain /register, then this function is run and all of this happens. Whenever we want to get information from a particular endpoint, there is an HTTP method. Here we can see the HTTP method is get. When we use get, it is expected that we get a response. When we use post, it is expected that we are sending information. We'll use the routes that I just showed to discuss how this is. But first of all, there is something called versioning that was done. And the reason is, over time, and the best way to manage APIs is to version them, in the sense that you create a version, this is V1, and within that V1 directory, you create all the functionalities and the endpoints. If your systems evolve over time and your database structure changes and there are major breaking changes, you don't want to edit V1 and then those who have API key configured and other systems configured to read information from the ECBS will now begin to have their systems fail. You don't want that to happen. Whenever there is a breaking change, you want to create a new version, V2, so that the endpoints will now be named in a structure like this: V1/client/validate login, like this. The users can now decide what version they want to run if they've not made edits to their file or their administration portal to be able to work with the new version. Then they can keep using the version 1. And when version 2 is going to be, or version 1 is going to be depreciated over some years, then they'll have enough time to be able to switch over to version 2 and use V2 when V2 becomes available, because at this time they've had enough time and they've been able to look at the API documentation to make changes or edits to their pages to be able to work with a newer version. So the versioning is one thing. So after the handover, you get access to all your source code. All the source code will be handed over to you, and then you decide what you want to do. If you want to add new things, you can add and unadd. And I would advise that every practice and trial should be done on the practice site or the practice source code. And when things work, you can now move them to production if you desire to change anything. So that is one thing. We have the versioning. So all the functionalities or all the endpoints are all within a version folder. So if I have version 2, everything will be in the V2 folder, and like that. When we connect to an endpoint, what happens is that the system, so on this system, we connect directly because we are on the same system. But assuming we are connecting from another system, then it's totally different. And that is the last thing we're going to look at today. We, first of all, want to see how this was configured for the IT staff to be able to make changes. Now, I'll go back to my command line, and I want to SSH into the server that holds this trial API. So what you will find on your system once the API is implemented on your servers is this: the directory, the root directory for the system. I just use the default Ubuntu root just so that it will be easy and there will be no complications. So we have the www.html directory. So you go to the var www/html, which is the same directory that you have all of your web files in the ECBS system. On this file, you get your ECBS API, which is the name of the API app. This is the Ubuntu default index page. You can remove it if you wish to remove that. Now, when we look at this directory structure of the API, we can identify two things. We have the environment file, which is a hidden file that is created on the server. The values on the environment file is the same values you have on the ECBS environment file. In the event that you want to have a two-way communication, then you open this environment file, and then once you open this environment file, you begin to add API key or whatever it is you want to add here. So you add the API key or whatever you need to add here, and that's with the API key of the other system you want ECBS to communicate with, and then you can now edit the code to be able to receive data from that system. We also have the PyProject.toml file. Now, because this uses Poetry for dependency management, so that if you decide to migrate your server, or you want to create a new server and you want to download your source code and re-implement or install on the server, you don't have to bother about all of what the system depends on, what packages you need to install. This Poetry will handle everything. So the first thing is always create a virtual environment, and you always activate the environment, and then you run Poetry install. So we already have a virtual environment, .venv. Your virtual environment can be any name you want. And if you look within this file, you will see all of the dependencies that has been installed. And anytime we want to do anything with this API, we want to start it, we want to stop it, we need to activate the environment. And once it's activated, you'll find the environment file here. Now it is at this point, let's assume we don't have the dependencies, that you run Poetry install. And once you do this, all of the dependencies will now be installed automatically, and then you have your system. We also use a different kind of process manager to be able to start this. Now, we have PM2 as the parallel networking software, which depends on Node.js. And the reason we did this is that Python, which is the language that was used to create this, will not run on Apache Web Server by default. And we need to find a way or something that makes it run on the web. And Ubicon is the package we use to run Python. Now, because I use FastAPI, Ubicon comes installed automatically with FastAPI. And for us to be able to start this server, we needed to use Ubicon, and it was easier to use Process Manager, so we can be able to look at the logs, PM2 log, to see everything that is happening on the API. So we can easily see when we have an error, if it's running correctly. All you want to see is 200 OK, several everywhere. And you can see when there's a request that was found and request that was not found here. So you can use that to see that the API is running and all of the logs from the API. The logs is not just the error log. It's not error log. It's a log of all the activities, all the requests, all the endpoints that was hit. So you can see the endpoint here with the request and what was requested. And you'll see the IP address of where it was requested for. So you can get all of the logs of your API from there. Now, we want to look at how we go to these different endpoints. Here we have these endpoints. I use this limited number of endpoints because I don't want it public. I've logged in successfully here. I have access to the list of endpoints that I can use. Now, this is the route I want to go to get a summary of all of the screenings. For me to get to this route, I need to go to the domain first, then / that route. So v1 / client / summary. And when I click on this, it should, if all is well, give me the summary of all of the screenings from the database. Now, this is a dashboard that's just almost like the surveillance dashboard that just displays everything you have, the trends, or whatever it is you want, the summary of the data to see how things are displayed. Now, when I go back again, and I want to get this, maybe I want to get a particular JSON response of a particular client. And JSON responses are the things we want for all systems to be able to understand. Whatever you do with the response is now dependent on what you want the data for in the first place. Do you want to have raw data of a client, or do you want to have summary data, or you just want to have surveillance reports, aggregated or disaggregated data? These are the things you decide within the country what you want. And then when I send out the endpoint documentations. At the end of all of the trainings, you will see the endpoints and how you will link them. But now let's look at how we can go to another system and request data from this system. Does anyone have questions before I do that? Does it make sense, or I should go over it before we move over to the practical part?
You can go over it just one more time before you continue.
Okay. All right. So we looked at the API and we're trying to get an understanding on what the API is meant for and how it was created and structured. We said that the ECBS administration role has the functionality for API configuration. And all the configuration here is just to generate API keys, to grant API key to whoever requests a key or whatever system requests a key, to be able to view all of the keys that have been assigned and set expiry dates for the different keys, and to be able to view all of the requests that has come in for API key. Now, we define partner as any system, any external organization, anybody who wants an API key to be able to get data from the ECBS system. So when you hear the partner name, it just means the name of the other system or the name of whoever has requested a key. Now, once a key is requested, and the way we request a key is in the ECBS homepage, there is API login here. Once you click on this, I'll probably change this from login to just go to API because it's not actually a login. Whichever organization or system doesn't have a key, and this can even be within the IT group where you want to now, maybe you have 5 different systems, one for lab, one for pharmacy, one for antenatal, different systems. And at this point, you want to be able to get any antenatal records, for instance, from the ECBS system on that antenatal system, instead of having to re-enter it on that system if it already exists on the ECBS system. So at this point, let's say we have an antenatal system called antenatal. You want to come to the API homepage, put in a name for the system organization and an email address for contact when the key is generated, who the key should be sent to. So let's put an address, and then is to get data, or I want to use it in production, or whatever the reason is. It doesn't really matter. The reason just guides whoever is granting the key to know the duration of time or the expiry date. So let's say I want to use it in production. I requested this. So the request has been submitted. That's all I need to wait for whenever the key is granted. When we come to the ECBS system here, and I log in back here, I will now see that the keys request, I have antenatal system requesting a key and the status is pending. So at this point, I can decide to grant the key if it is the system I'm aware of, or I'm the one who created this request and I want to grant the key. On the drop-down menu, I will see antenatal as part of the partner. So all of the partners who still have their key request pending will be displayed in the drop-down menu, and you just select and you choose any key from the keys that you have generated previously, and then you set an expiry date. So this is for production. Let's say I just want it to expire in 1 year. So you can decide the structure of how you set expiry just for security. If you want to make everything expire at the end of the year, and then you know that at the end of the year you have to extend the expiry date for all the keys that are there, or you want to reassign new keys, it's always better to just extend the expiry of the same key, except if the key has been compromised and you just need to grant a new key and then ask them to change their API keys. So I'll put this for the last Friday in December 2025. So the key is there and the expiry is long in the future. So this will still work. Now I have this API key. What will now happen to the partner is when they come to the home page and they go to the API and come to pages and login, they can now enter the API key and it grants access to the dashboard where they can see all the routes and definitions. Now, more things will be here, and you find in documentation. Like I said earlier, because of security issues, I don't want to expose everything that are sensitive on this training. But I have enough routes for us to understand the pattern, and everything is going to be exactly the same, regardless. Even if you have 100 endpoints on this page, it's exactly the same structure. So we have this dashboard. All it does is to give them access to be able to see what the endpoints are and the definition. They can also come to the drop-down menu to get a summary, which will go to the endpoint for summary, and to just aggregate all of the information in the database and create a visualization for all of the different screenings and everything that is there. What I can do also is to use the reporting indicator also. So what I have already done is to use the reporting indicator for you to just get the figures one time from the API without having to go to the systems or link. You can also get it directly on the dashboard to say these are the values that you need from the ECBS system. So you don't need to log into ECBS to look at the surveillance reports, and the API will already do that connection and create all the plots that you need for it, and every other thing is there. So when we get back to the dashboard to see the endpoints, then we can decide that this is what we want to do, and let's look at what the endpoint does. We talked about versioning, and every time you come to the domain for the API, you have to use / the version number that you are using, which is in this case version 1, / the directory, the root directory for that version. And the directory for this is clients, and we defined it like this. So you always have to know what the routes are for you to be able to access information. Now we have this endpoint, which is defined using the HTTP method get, which means that we expect to return information, which is a summary. Here also we have this that expects us to have a unique ID of a client to be able to get information about that client. We are going to look at how we use this. Let's say, for instance, we have a client. Let me go to the database. Okay, we have this unique ID. Let's try to use this unique ID. And we come here to / v1 / client / client ID, and we don't have that here because this has / clients. Let's see that. Sorry, / client ID. So you can now get the JSON response of all of the information that you need. Now we get the information of this client, but all identifiable information are encrypted. So even if your endpoints are compromised, the identity of the client will not be known. We only get the information you need. We have the testing code, we have the unique ID, the gender. Now, it is for you to decide what you want to do with the JSON response. Are you connecting, or you are passing this value from your application to this API for you to get this response? Do you want to put the response somewhere? Do you want it to be displayed on a table in a nice container in the other system for the other person to see? Do you want to extract a particular value from it? What you want to extract, is it just the gender? This or the date of the report? This information here gives you the names of all of the columns, the values that are explanatory to what values they hold. So at this point, you know that the gender is female. This is how it is defined. You know the JSON response. Now you look at your database structure or the system you are trying to, you are getting this data for, and maybe it is named sex. And what you want to do is you want to maybe update, maybe the gender of this client was not specified on that system. Maybe your response is for you to look at what the gender is here, and you want to tell the system in your code that whatever the gender is, update the sex column of this database to match what the ECBS has. Those are the commands you can do. So the JSON response is there. Is it going to be for viewing? Are you going to use it to update or send a patch request to another system? Are you just going to display it on the page for whoever is looking at that client record to see that these are the records of the client from the ECBS? Do you want all of the response, or you just want particular values like just the gender? So these are the things you decide within the countries. You want to look at the HIV screening of the same client? Let's do that so that you can see it. And then we'll put the ID. So you need to know the client ID. So what you will do with your system is you are going to be passing this ID to the route. It's not, because if it's a button you are creating for any of the page or any of the pages, you can't individually pass the client ID. You want it to be automatically done, and the ID should be passed based on whatever ID that is logged into on that system. And so when I do this, we'll get the JSON response also, and we'll see what the screening is. So if this is for the lab system and what you want to see is, or this is for a different system, maybe the diabetes system, you have a different system for diabetes management, or you have your hospital management information system where other diseases are managed there, or other illness are managed there. You want to see the results recorded for HIV from the ECBS for the particular client. You know what the ID is. Maybe the ID is passed once you log into the retrieve the client's care card or the client's folder from the other system and pass it to the API route so that you can get that information. So you decide what you want to do with the information. Do you just want to see the type of screening and the results for that client, or you want to see any information? You want to see the date, you see what the values are, then you can now edit your code or for that page of the client so that it gets this information from ECBS and displays it for viewing. And so that trip will happen once every time they log into the client's page, and all of the information from ECBS, current information, will just be displayed on that system. So how do we get our systems to work like this, or to get information from an external system? So that's the next thing we're going to look at now. So before that, does anyone have question?
All good.
All right. So we've seen we've seen some of the endpoints. Now let's assume that I want to get information from this live system, but I want to get it on my local machine, from my local machine. Let me go to my local machine here. I will come to my code, and what you do, let me say for instance now, this is my source code for a different system. Let's assume this is a different system, and I want to have a page that's maybe a system administrator page on this place, or I have a system administrator dashboard that I wake up every day and I want to make sure that all the systems are running and are in good health, right? So I can come here and say at the roots I want to check what is going to happen. But now recall that I talked about the environment file. The first thing you want to do is to look at your source code for where you have your environment values being extracted. For ECBS, we have it in our settings file. For many applications or modern day application, you will always have a settings file that has all of these values extracted from the environment file. Now, we define the API key with a variable called API key, and it gets this from an environment variable API key. When I go to my environment file, so I have my environment file in this directory and it's named .env. When I come here and I will set at the very, let's say at the end here, I want to set the API key. Now, this is an API key here, but let's look at the API key that we got from the system. So let me get an API key that was generated for, let's say, for pharmacy. So I'll just go straight to the database and get this API key. And now I have this API key. I can come to my environment file and now put that API key here. And I'll save this value. So now I have an API key that can connect there in my environment file. And I have my settings file able to read out. So I'll put this on my local environment to be able to read that value. Normally, we don't expose environment files. We use a file to extract that information. It just resides on the server. When we do our CI/CD training next week, we'll see that we don't even transfer the environment file out of the system. So the values you see on my environment file on my system is different from what is on the server. Well, for each of the system, your values are set, your different passwords are unique. And so we extract the value this way. We have that. So let's say now at the root of this application, we want to create a file that is just for system administrator. So this is what you would do on your system. You have access to your source code. Let's say you're creating a new application just for tax management or to handle things. I'll create a new file here and I'll call the file, let's call it test, or let's say admin test. So this is what you have to do on your system. You create the file. Now the style and all of the pattern that I've been here on this file, because I'm using PHP for this application. Now the beauty of API or using microservices is that every programmer can work in the language they're comfortable with and everything will still work as one. So I can create a microservice that uses Python, another one with Java, another one with PHP, and everything will work as one unit. And that is the beauty about building different things as different APIs that work together. So I use Python for the API that we just saw. I'm using PHP for something else, and I'm going to use JavaScript for something else. And so if you have 10 programmers in the country and somebody is more comfortable with a language, you don't need to restrict them to learn a language. You just need to create a microservice for that functionality in the language you're comfortable with, and everything works together. And so we create this page, and since it's a PHP page, I'll start this. So this is what you do on your system. So if you have Java, you're doing Java, you create a new page like that for your functionalities. And let's say I want to just import all of the header files. For instance, I already have header files. Let me just import them. So I put all of my header files, which is something you already have for a common style or common headers for all of your files. Then these other imports, like my settings file, to be able to get the values that are on the environment file. You do something like that, and because this class that holds helper function is a class that I have to create an object of before I can use it to connect to the database. Now our settings file does our database connection. Our classes file does all the connections and everything that we need. Now, this is the system. It is connected. We're assuming that you have access to your source code. You can create a blank page. We want to first check this API key that has been extracted from the settings file. And we want to check if this key, there's no need for this, is redundant actually, but we want to check if this key exists in the database, API database. Now there's a different database configuration that will be done where on your environment file you have a value of the database host, which instead of local host at this point is going to connect to the database of that system. And then you have to allow connections by editing your database. If you're using a SQL database, or maybe MySQL or MariaDB, you have to go to the configuration file and allow connection from external systems to be able to access the database. And so that's why I said that you will need to have access to these things. So if your systems are not systems that you have access to the source code, then you have to deal with the vendors of those systems to be able to have that access, to be able to create whatever you want to put, or give them documentation to edit the source code for your system to be able to read from ECBS. Once we do this, we want to connect to the database. I will just use this to make it faster. And we want to say, I'll use this structure, just ignore the whole thing. I'm just trying to check the table. I've done all of the other work of connecting to the database with my environment file, making sure I can access the ECBS database and checking for the key. Now this key that I'm trying to get is on the live system from this local system. So I'm just going to reverse this just to make this work. But under normal circumstance, this is supposed to be what the code will be. I'm just doing this for test purpose. So if this is the case, I want to check, let's say now, if this doesn't happen, I want to say the API key is wrong or is not valid. And if this is not the case, then let's say the API key is valid, you want to do something. Let's say we just want to create, let's use HTML now. Let's say we just want to create a page or a link directly to the API now. Now this is where it is important for us to know the route. So I will use my anchor to get the link. And let's say test connection, for instance. And then my href attributes will now put the route for the API. Now, the route for this, let's see, we want to test that test and we'll get this response. The connection to the API is working. This is the route or the endpoint that I want to use. So I'll come here and I'll put this as the value for my href attribute. And let's say I want to see the health. Let's say you have any metric software that you use to sound an alarm if something is wrong with a particular system and you get notification for when your system goes down or something. This is where the health becomes important. So let's say I have a route called health for the system. So let's just call it API health. So when something goes wrong or there are problems with your server or connection, this will kick in. Let's say check health or check CPU, for instance, or health or whatever it is you want to check. And there's a route that does that, or an endpoint that does that, sorry. And so I'm going to put that endpoint. And this is going to be in the root, which is called health. These endpoints are in your documentation. So now you see we just created a page and we can easily go to this page. The name of the page is admin test.php. And so when we come here, and I come to my localhost /admin test.php. Now we get this page. So I've created a page that just checks this. And I just want everything to be by the click of a button. So assuming this is my system administrator page that I just created, and I click on test connection, it should tell me that the API is working. You can now see my response, JSON response back. You can either want the page to display the JSON response, or you want to pass it somewhere to just create a nice button to give you an alarm or to whatever it is. But usually all of the responses are JSON response because that is one response that all language can pass. And if I come here and I say I want to see the health of the server and everything, and it now tells me, healthy, this is what you want to see, then I know for the morning that I tested all my systems, they're working fine. I'm not expecting any user to call me for system failure. So this is one thing you can do with the endpoints. Create a page like this. Another thing you can do also is, let's say we want to get information about a particular client. And on the client's page, you have created or added this one line of code. Let's say, for instance, let's add this line of code, for instance. So on the client's page, you come there to say, you get the ID of the client, you pass it into a form or something, and then you pass it to this URL, which is, this is the client ID. And what I want to get is to get the HIV screening of the client on the page. And so on that client's page, you put this one line of code that has these endpoints to it, / maybe a placeholder that will now be replaced with whatever the ID of the client is. And once you put this here and you come to that page, you can only click a button and it gives you your response about the client. If you don't want this JSON response, so it's a raw response like this, you decide what you want to do with the response when it comes. Do you want to pass it? You want to display it somewhere else? You want to save it in a database? That is what you decide within the countries, what you want to do. But the basic thing is to understand the endpoint, know how you can create new pages to use those endpoints on your system and decide if you want to use this endpoint within the client's page and not on a new page where you get all of these path parameters inserted based on the whatever the path is requesting for. Does anyone have a question? Okay, I have a question in the chat. How often would you recommend to do system checks and what maintenance requirements are they? Now, system checks depends on what the system administrator wants, but I would prefer you do your system checks every morning, every day before system use, before users start using system. You want to make sure that things are running fine. Maintenance requirements, you always want to check your servers, make sure your CPU usage is where it's supposed to be, and backups are active all day. So those are the maintenance requirements. It will come in the final documentations and recommendations. Anybody else has question? Okay. So in the absence of questions, I'm assuming that it is understood what how the API works and what you need to do. I will send out all of the documentations and all of the database structures and everything you need to do with all the endpoints documentation at the end of all of the workshops by the first week in December for the latest, and then you can go ahead to configure your system. Now, note that from December to June next year is a warranty period. So if you run into trouble and you're trying to do something on your system, you can contact me to help you out with that. So like the email I sent out this morning, I need a domain for the API for the countries, and your domain can just be api.yourcurrent-ECBS domain or your current ECBS subdomain. So it will be a subdomain of the subdomain or something like that. So api.ecbs.governmentdomain.org. Whatever your domain was for ECBS to make it easier. And then as soon as I get that, you have your API live for you to be able to see your live data within your APIs. You decide if you want your API to have internet facing or just remain an internal tool that runs and they can hit the endpoints. All right. So I'll make the recordings available. And if you have any questions, we can discuss them further in the next training for next week, Wednesday and Thursday for the CI/CD. We can accommodate all the questions you have from all the videos you've watched during those trainings, as they are the last training for this consultancy that will help us understand all that we need to understand. All right. So thank you, everyone, and see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.